Today we are back to politeness, which we have already discussed, but this time perhaps we can see how politeness is viewed within a relevant theoretic approach. Studies of linguistic politeness have traditionally assumed a Gracian norm-based approach to communication, and this is actually how we presented politeness previously. Perhaps you remember that this Gracian approach assumes that human beings as rational creatures cooperate when communicating, which means that they abide by certain norms, such as quantity, quality, manner and relation. And if they comply with the norms, the effect is a maximally efficient exchange of information. These norms are collectively called clarity principles because they are responsible for this effective, clear, to the matter exchange of information. Now, if we want to convey some additional meaning, then we may exploit one of the norms and, for instance, communicate that perhaps this time we want to be extra polite. Now, therefore, we may assume that if we do not abide strictly by the norms, we flout a particular norm, and in that way we generate an additional implicit conclusion, implicature, and this might be also the information that we are being polite. So instances of the use of politeness forms of strategies necessarily communicate a message above and beyond the one that motivates the communicative act. So if instead of saying open the door, I say could you possibly open the door, or could you be so kind as to open the door, I in fact convey two pieces of information. One is that I want the addressee to open the door, and the other is that I'm being polite. Now, this normative approach, Gracian approach, corresponds to the theory of speech acts, because again, within this theory of speech acts, we assume that particular linguistic forms are specified for particular communicative purposes. So, for example, the imperative form, if is chosen, is or should be selected for issuing a request. Now, if it is not, if we go for a different form, then it means that we want to convey an additional layer of meaning. Thus, the conclusion might be that whether we assume the Gracian approach or speech acts approach, then the linguistic politeness is communicated. So linguistic politeness constitutes a message in itself. It is a conversational implicature. Yet politeness is more often anticipated than communicated. Okay, so this means that in fact we are not alarmed if people produce what we expect them to produce. We are alarmed if they are perhaps over polite in a way or under polite. Okay, so it seems that the form "could you possibly open the door" goes unnoticed if we find it appropriate in the circumstances. Thus, the conclusion might be that Brown and Levinson's view, according to which politeness constitutes a conversational implicature, is counterintuitive in that it predicts that whenever a polite form or strategy is used, an additional layer of meaning is conveyed. Our experience tells us that polite forms go unnoticed despite the speaker's use of polite forms. So perhaps you remember we also discussed briefly the definition of politeness provided by Grandy, that actually it is a match between what we expect and what we are offered, and if this match is perfect, if we are not alarmed in any way, then we do not perceive a particular form as polite. It simply is as it should be. But obviously we would be alarmed if we were not offered the form that is expected. Now, Gabriel Kasper phrases our perception of politeness in the following way. Competent adult members comment on the absence of politeness where it is expected and its presence where it is not expected. Thus, we might conclude that in fact politeness is not communicated, and perhaps it should not be regarded as a conversational implicature. So far we've discussed this norm-based approach to politeness, and we cast some doubts on that approach, and now perhaps we are back to some details of Brown and Levinson's calculation of politeness and Brown and Levinson's theory of politeness. So the choice of a linguistic form is influenced by the speaker's assumptions about the relationship with the hearer. These assumptions can be subsumed under P, D and R. This means that perhaps you remember that when we are to issue a request, for instance, or express some criticism, before we phrase an utterance, we take into account certain social factors. So the first is P, which is power. So we have to decide whether the addressee is superior in rank or inferior in rank, whether he or she is older or younger, and female or male. So all these factors contribute to our calculation of power. Then D stands for distance, that is how close we are, whether we are acquaintances, whether we are close friends, whether we are intimates, and obviously this parameter also affects the choice of a particular strategy. And finally, rank of imposition, the last variable, because sometimes we ask for something really small, for a petty favor, and sometimes for something more substantial, and obviously what we ask for again does influence the choice of the linguistic strategy. Now, the choice is aimed at mitigating potential face damage. Though even when the speaker is aiming to protect the hearer's face, her ultimate motivation is to maintain or raise her own status within the group, and or to ensure her continued well-being in both the long and the short term. So it means that we calculate the risk involved in a particular speech act and select the appropriate linguistic strategy to protect the face of the addressee. But at the same time, we protect our own face because we want to be accepted within this community, and we want our goals to be achieved. So we may say that this choice of a particular form is carefully calculated. So we've just presented the basic assumptions of the politeness model by Brown and Levinson. And now we are back to relevance theory. And this is going to be again a sort of a digression. We are back to, that is how communication is defined in relevance theory. What is communicated? So central to an appreciation of what in relevance theory is communicated by an act of ostensive communication is a notion of manifestness. An assumption is manifest to an individual if she is capable of representing it and assessing its probable truth. All those manifest assumptions constitute one's cognitive environment. When manifest to two individuals and assumed by them to be manifest to both of them, assumptions are mutually manifest. So, we may say that they constitute mutual cognitive environment. It sounds awful, but it's very simple. So, relevance theory assumes that we can communicate something that is not manifest. So the act of communication consists in putting across something that it is not obvious to the speaker and to the addressee. Okay? So if something that is obvious to the speaker and obvious to the addressee is put across, then it is not the act of communication. The act of communication involves a change in the cognitive environment. So I, for example, inform you about something that you are not aware of. So I introduce the change into your cognitive environment. And obviously now the change involves our mutual cognitive environment, because I know that you already know about this new fact that I informed you about, right? So the communicator's aim is to make manifest to her audience, by the use of an ostensive stimulus, her intention to make manifest a set of assumptions I. Again, it sounds awful, but it simply means that I, as a speaker, use a particular stimulus, that is a particular utterance, and by means of that utterance, I inform you about something. I make something obvious to you. I make something manifest to you. A set of assumptions, because it is not only the content of the utterance that I communicate, but this utterance is very likely to activate a number of assumptions in your mind. So my use of an ostensive stimulus, that is of an utterance, activates the whole set of assumptions in your mind. So I make them sort of manifest. I hope you remember that relevance theory is called an ostensive inferential theory. So the process of inferencing is of utmost importance in our comprehension, which means that decoding, that is decoding the stimulus, is just the initial step in the process of comprehension, which is mainly inferential in nature. So providing the audience with the ostensive stimulus, which is an utterance, enlists the addressee's inferential abilities in the task of inferring the content of I. A large set of assumptions can be economically communicated without its total content being encoded. So you know that sometimes it may be a semi-verbal message, it may be just a gesture, it may be an expression on your face, but still that kind of stimulus is capable of activating in you a set of assumptions, and then you finally derive the intended message, which was difficult to verbalize. So mind you that the selection of an appropriate stimulus plus the presumption of relevance make it highly likely that the whole content will be made manifest, and the whole content, I mean all these assumptions that I want to be manifest, will be manifest, even though I use a very skeletal or elliptic stimulus. Ostensive signaling one's intention modifies the thoughts of another and alters the mutual cognitive environment of the communicator. So this is what I've already mentioned, that I introduce a change within your cognitive environment, because now you're informed about something. And because I know that you know, we may say that in that way I have also introduced the change in my cognitive environment. So the change actually takes place in the mutual cognitive environment. So on the one hand, we've discussed the assumptions of Brown and Levinson. On the other hand, we've discussed communication within relevance theory, how communication is viewed within relevance theory. And now it should be apparent that these two approaches cannot be reconciled because certain problems arise. The first problem is what, if anything, is communicated by linguistic politeness? In what way does the communication of politeness modify the mutual cognitive environment of the communicators? What is the content of the message? Is politeness always communicated, or is it communicated only in particular cases? So we will try to answer these questions and perhaps to point to some drawbacks of the politeness model by Brown and Levinson. So you remember, we have to calculate power, distance and the rank of imposition inherent in a particular speech act to decide which strategy should be selected. So there is a correlation between form, strategy and the weightiness of a face-threatening act. Now, power, distance and the rank of imposition are socially determined values, and as such, one would expect them to be mutually manifest to participants. So what I'm trying to say here is that if I want something of you, or you have a request to me, then we more or less know what to expect. So the power can be easily assessed between the interlocutors, the distance is known, and the rank of imposition inherent in a particular speech act is also obvious. So these are obvious variables. I mean, values are obvious, not variables, but values are obvious. Thus we may say that they are mutually manifest. Okay, so I know what to expect of you and you know what to expect of me. You know how I should address you and I know how you should turn to me for something, okay? If you use a form that I consider not appropriate, then I'm somehow alarmed, okay? But only then. But if you offer what I expect, I'm not alarmed at all. So it's very difficult to say that you generate a conversational implicature that you're polite. I just take it for granted that you're polite. I'm alarmed if you're not polite. So if one party employs a form which does not fulfill the expectations, the result will be the change in the addressee's cognitive environment. So highly relevant to the hearer is the evidence that the speaker ranked one of the variables in a manner incompatible with the hearer's assumptions about the mutual cognitive environment. So perhaps I may conclude that you somehow miscalculated the power factor, or that you miscalculated the distance factor, for example, if you call me by my first name, or that you miscalculated the rank inherent in this particular speech act. Okay, so then I am alarmed. I try to derive a conclusion which variable was misranked, but now, mind you, that even if I'm alarmed, you can observe the change only in my cognitive environment. So it is not as yet the act of communication. For the act of communication to take place, the change must occur in the mutual cognitive environment and must be intended by the speaker. That's the key point. It must be intended by the speaker. So, for instance, my interlocutor miscalculated the distance between himself and me, but still, if he is pretty unaware of that, we cannot say that this is act of communication. Okay, so I may believe that he is not polite, but it is not the act of communication. He did not intend to be impolite. So, as you can see, the first message that I have to obtain is the manipulation of the weightiness. That is, I am somehow alarmed that one of the variables was misranked. But the second message I should obtain is that the speaker intended it that way. So I need the speaker's motivation. If there is no speaker's motivation, then there is no this is not the act of communication. Now, according to Brown and Levinson, the communication of politeness is the aim of polite linguistic behavior. Relevance theory assumes that polite forms will only communicate something above and beyond the underlying message if the value of W does not match the communicator's mutually manifest assumptions concerning W. So as you can see, these two theories differ in the way in which they perceive politeness. Politeness is not always communicated according to relevance theories, okay? Because we are not alarmed. If there is no change in the cognitive environment, there is no active communication. So now perhaps we can follow various routes of interpreting politeness. So mind you that the interlocutors start their exchange having certain assumptions about their mutual relationships. So the speaker has certain assumptions about her relationship with the hearer. And on the basis of these assumptions, the speaker produces an utterance. So these are aspects of the speaker's verbal behavior. So these assumptions affect the aspects of the speaker's verbal behavior. Now, the utterance that the speaker produces, that is, these aspects of the speaker's verbal behavior, may turn out to be compatible with the hearer's assumptions about their relationship, or incompatible with the hearer's assumptions about their relationship. If they are compatible, then obviously the addressee is not alarmed, politeness goes unnoticed. So these aspects of the speaker's verbal behavior are not relevant enough to be worth the hearer's attention. Now, if on the other hand, these aspects of the speaker's verbal behavior are incompatible with the hearer's assumptions about their relationship, the speaker is alarmed, and those aspects are relevant enough to be worth the hearer's attention. So, mind you that the first of these routes has to be eliminated from our considerations of politeness, because politeness is definitely not communicated. We should follow the second path, but again, there are at least two options here. So we are back to the situation when the aspects of the speaker's verbal behavior are relevant enough. We have been alarmed. We believe that the form used was not appropriate. Now, in what way was it not appropriate? It may signal that the speaker holds the hearer in higher regard than he had assumed, which means that the form was very, very polite, over-polite, hyper-polite. Or the speaker, it may indicate, this form that the speaker uses, may indicate that the speaker holds the hearer in lower regard than he had assumed. In both cases, we can attribute intentions to the speaker. If we do attribute the intention to the speaker, then obviously it is the act of communication. That is, politeness is communicated deliberately. If we do not attribute the intention to the speaker, then we cannot say that this is the act of communication. We may derive some conclusions about the speaker. We may find him very polite, or we may decide that this is a very rude person, but in the sense that it's not refined or cultured, that kind of thing. But we cannot say that it was his intention to be impolite. Thus, the hearer may attribute intention to the speaker or may not attribute intention to the speaker, and only in the case of the hearer attributing the intention to the speaker, we may decide that politeness is communicated. The relevant theoretic analysis permits a distinction between the unself-conscious compliance with and the self-conscious exploitation of socio-cultural constraints on language usage. So let me explain that. Unself-conscious compliance with the constraints, the socio-cultural constraints, refers to that kind of politeness that goes unnoticed. So it is not communicated. It is what we expect. Okay? And self-conscious exploitation of sociocultural constraints and language use refers to those instances when we are alarmed, when we believe that the form offered is not the appropriate one. Okay? So there are certain sociocultural constraints on language usage. So we form our utterances under certain sociocultural constraints, and this means social indexing view of politeness, that is normative view of politeness, and mind you that this is manifest. So we live in a particular community, in particular society, and we all share these norms. So these are sociocultural constraints. We're all aware of these norms, and we try to formulate our utterances in accordance with these norms. Every competent member of this community. So we know what to expect from one another. Okay? So this is what is meant by anticipation of politeness rather than communication of politeness. Okay? We do not communicate politeness, we anticipate politeness. On the other hand, we may manipulate this sociocultural constraints, that we are pretty aware of them, and even if we know what is expected of us, we somehow strategically select a different form to convey an extra meaning. So this is self-conscious exploitation of sociocultural constraints on language. So these are the situations when we are overpolite or when we are underpolite. The description by a hearer of a speaker's verbal behavior as polite or impolite depends on his noting this aspect and on the motivation he believes to be behind it. That is, the speaker has to evaluate the esteem in which the speaker holds the addressee has to evaluate the esteem in which the speaker holds the hearer on the basis of what has been said. So perhaps now we'll concentrate on the situation when politeness is communicated, and you remember that there are two options. So the one is that we conclude that the speaker holds us in higher esteem than we expect. So let's start from this situation. So the utterance is in a way overpolite and we are somehow alarmed. The evidence is that the speaker holds the hearer in higher esteem than the hearer had thought mutually manifest. So the hearer attributes some motivation to the speaker. So he may find the speaker's behavior insincere and decide that she's motivated by a desire to flatter him in order to achieve her aims. Or he might assume that the speaker is trying to make up for some prior face-threatening to re-establish an equilibrium. So that's politeness as a repair work. The prior action was not indicative of the esteem. So let me just make a comment on these sentences. So if people are overpolite, our conclusion might be that they are insincere. So this is quite likely. But there are instances of overpoliteness that are somehow justified, and they are called here repair work. So if we unintentionally somehow misranked a particular variable and now want to make up for it, compensate for it, then we start to be overpolite, then we say something, I'm terribly sorry, I really didn't mean to be rude, I'm so sorry. And we are obviously exaggerating a bit, but the point is that we want to re-establish an equilibrium, and then this kind of overpoliteness is usually accepted. Okay, so if our prior action was not indicative of the appropriate esteem, because of, for instance, intergroup differences, I belong to a different group and you belong to a different group, and I simply did not notice that perhaps within your group the expectations are sort of different, and I then used the form that was not appropriate, then, which did not indicate the real esteem in which I hold you, then after a while, after after I realize that was not appropriate, I may want to make up for that. And this is this over-politeness, which is acceptable and which is not considered insincere. Obviously, the words uttered may be indicative of the lower esteem. That is, the speaker signals that he does not respect us the way we should be respected. And obviously this is the communication of rudeness, intentional communication of rudeness, but I don't suppose that that particular case demands any further explanation. This is just obvious. If people want to be intentionally rude. But mind you, whether they want to be intentionally rude or whether they want to be intentionally over-polite, this strategic use, strategic in the sense of deliberate, the strategic use of politeness is parasitic on the unself-conscious social indexing use. That is something that we take for granted, simply. So it is the exploitation of the expectation that certain socio-cultural constraints on behavior will be observed. And only this exploitation, according to relevance theory, can be viewed as communication of politeness. Now, communicators have short and long-term aims. So a short aim is to get the addressee to do or believe something, and a long-term aim is to become or remain a liked and respected member of a group. Now, the stimulus will make manifest only those assumptions that are not detrimental to either of these aims. So that's the calculation. That's how the calculation of a particular strategy is motivated, that we want to have our short and long aims fulfilled. We want to get something, for instance, we want to express criticism on the one hand, but on the other hand, we want to be respected and accepted within the community. So we have to keep the balance. The rational communicator will want her stimulus to make manifest only those assumptions which are either neutral or beneficial implications, beneficial with respect to short-term aims. Long-term aims to maintain or increase one's standing in the eyes of group co-members. One way to raise one's standing is to provide evidence that the speaker holds the addressee in high esteem, because then it will somehow require reciprocity. So we believe that if we indicate that we respect other people, so they will be obliged to pay that back in a way. The evidence, linguistic form that we use must be relevant and sincere. So the addressee must believe that the evidence reflects the esteem, which means that we cannot grossly exaggerate, okay? Because then if we grossly exaggerate and if we are undeservedly polite, over-polite, then obviously we may run the risk of raising suspicions in the addressee. So politeness is actually a matter of balance between appearing rude and appearing too polite. Okay, so if we signal by our utterances that we really hold the addressee in high esteem, we should keep in mind that it must be somehow sincere, or it must give the impression of sincerity. Speakers wishing to achieve their goals will choose forms that provide evidence that the hearer's estimation of the esteem is accurate. So, the unmarked social indexing view of politeness. So they will not try to exaggerate. If the esteem is higher than assumed, the speaker will be happy if her intention is manifest in cases of repair, but not in cases of Machiavellian manipulation, so not in cases of apparent insincerity. We may conclude that in many cases, or perhaps in most cases, politeness does not constitute a message. Numerous strategies are directed at avoiding unwanted implications or miscommunication rather than communicate implicatures. The relevance of polite behavior to observers does not entail its relevance to participants. That is, we may, observing a scene, we may say that this person is polite, but when we are involved in a scene, we just do not pay too much attention, as long as the person is polite. We start observing when the person somehow deviates from what we expect. Mind you that the assumptions made manifest are not necessarily relevant, but their absence would be, and in a manner undesirable to the speaker. This claim does not preclude the strategic exploitation of a norm. That is, if we say, could you please be quiet, then it is just social indexing view of politeness. It goes unnoticed. But we can intentionally exploit the norm, and then we say, could you please be quiet? And obviously if we stress please, then the addressee is forced to search for extra implicatures, but obviously the stress is required. So we follow the norm, which does not communicate politeness, but we may intentionally exploit this norm and then communicate something beyond the form. The ostensive stimulus is the most relevant one compatible with communicators' abilities and preferences. Now, this last sentence comes from Sperber-Wilson's relevance theory, and obviously this sentence does not refer only to politeness, but it can be successfully used in the context of politeness. So we choose a stimulus, a polite form, which is compatible with our abilities and our preferences. So what is meant in this context by abilities and preferences are sociocultural considerations. Thank you for your attention.